Uh, my name is Herbert Stern. I'm a World War II veteran that was drafted in this late summer of 1941, and I spent a year and some months at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, with the 9th Infantry Division, one of the regular Army divisions, and we were sent overseas to North Africa and eventually to Sicily, to England for 6 months to train American troops that would be in the Normandy invasion. And we landed in Utah Beach on D+3, went all through France, Belgium, Germany, including the Battle of the Bulge, and eventually in late April of 1945 met the Russian army on the Elbe River in Germany before we went into occupation in southern Germany. My division in occupation formed an association that still exists, mostly run by the sons and daughters of the veterans, and meets once a year. We are, in this year of 2017, meeting in Mesa, Arizona for our 72nd reunion. So much for our background history. In 2012, I was interviewed along with 16 other Texas veterans from various branches of the military that had somewhat unusual backgrounds. And eventually the interviews were formed into an anthology that is called Tattooed on My Soul. The name of the book was derived from one of the veterans that was interviewed, who was at Pearl Harbor and was next to the Arizona, and in his description said, "I will never forget what I saw here. It is tattooed on my soul." I'm very fortunate and honored to be a part of this book and have my history, not only of the service, but my background in this book. And one of the main events during almost 4 years of service was our liberation of a slave labor camp in northeast Germany in the Harz Mountains. And in order to currently summarize for you what I described at that time, I would like to read from the passages that I, at the time, wrote.
I would just like to interrupt you should give her just a brief summary. He's born in Germany. He's a Jewish refugee from Berlin.
Oh, okay.
And because he knew German, he did all kinds of things in the army that he wouldn't have done otherwise.
Oh,
He
okay.
interviewed wounded prisoners and so on. Yeah. Sorry.
Around April 11th and April 12th, 1945, we were clearing pockets of resistance in the Ruhr industrial areas. Our latest assignment was to start a 150-mile motor march to the Harz-Nordhausen area. In this area, remnants of the 11th SS Panzer Army were bottled up, refusing to surrender. German High Command had also formed 3 new divisions. They too were among the holdouts. 2 elite divisions began facing the 9th, meaning our division, 9th Infantry Division. The Harz Mountains had few equals in national fortification. It was approximately 22 miles across and 68 miles long, up to 4,000 feet, excellent observation posts. Unquestionably, the Hitler regime chose this area to become a highly industrialized enterprise. As I recall, the First Army, American Army, planned to bypass the Harz Mountains fortress, then encircle the area. The reduction of this pocket constituted the last major obstacle facing the 7th Corps. We were part of the 7th Corps, meaning several divisions. As we were motoring mostly in 2.5-ton trucks toward the town of Nordhausen, we came upon a railroad yard and saw on flat cars fins and other large components of V-2 rockets. We came upon the flat cars and other large components of V-2 rockets strictly by accident. All of a sudden, we noticed a railroad yard. I got out of the truck and said, I want to climb onto the flat car to see how high these fins really are. Several other guys did the same thing. Then we got back on the trucks, and here, 2 minutes later, approximately a quarter of a mile away, we came upon a well-camouflaged entrance to a mountain tunnel with big netting around and large poles that looked like they're made like a piece of knitting stacked upside down. These were apparently part of the rockets, but what part I still don't know at this point because everything was disassembled. We saw a narrow gauge railway going right into that mountain facility. We went in there first to take a look. Inside the tunnel were rows of highly placed electric lights. We observed small gauge railroad tracks, long steel tables, some benches, scattered chains, and other unidentified paraphernalia. The tunnel was all lit up. It looked like a factory that had been emptied out completely. There were no signs of human beings inside the tunnel. Then we walked a little further, about 400 to 500 yards, and lo and behold, we are seeing all these people lying there on the ground. We started taking pictures. In a way, cruel as it may sound, we didn't have a bunch of individuals come asking for help. None of that happened because the few that were alive were really virtually dead. The carnage and horror of Nordhausen had been uncovered earlier that day by tankers of the 3rd Armored Division and infantrymen of the 10th Division of the 104th Division. In the slave labor camp The living and the dead were lying side by side. The living were too emaciated to move their limbs. The dead were unburied or half buried. SS troops had stacked bodies in ditches, yet we took photos with cameras we recently acquired while fighting in the Ruhr. We had uncovered a German aqua plant, made cameras and tripods and things like that, with large inventories of new cameras, tripods, and lenses. We walked around. There were no barracks, there were no facilities. If there were barracks, they had been bombed out. In the periphery of the camp, there were any number of buildings that were completely bombed out, just the steel structure was still standing. Then along with it, you were constantly feeling, I'm going to throw up because it's of its overwhelming stench. At the same time, it was so quiet. It was just dead. This dead silence. It was like a cloud was overhanging everything. It was just an eerie, very eerie feeling of no sound, highly unusual in that respect. Some of our medical officers did get involved in sorting out and seeing whether somebody was still alive, or having the townspeople take out the dead who were virtual skeletons. That's what they were, just skeletal remains of people that were put in these trenches alongside. We learned that one group which could not walk had been chained in the mountain tunnels for 3 months without seeing daylight. I also spotted a bank of very large ovens on the premises. There was no doubt that camp personnel burned the dead in these ovens. On the grates you could see bones. In the time we learned that Nordhausen had a long drawn out system of torture. One method was to crowd several hundred prisoners into a courtyard. There, on a raised platform, the condemned were hanged. Others were taken to the mountain tunnel, chained to work benches, and worked to death or beaten to death. They were there to assemble parts of the V-2 rockets. Almost all prisoners were simply starved to death. The prisoners of this notorious camp were French, Russian, Poles, Lithuanians, Romanians. I'm not certain there any Jews were at the camp. We commandeered the mayor of nearby Nordhausen to round up able-bodied men to dig the additional long trenches to bury the skeletal bodies. I also remember that several townspeople exclaimed that they knew nothing about the slave labor camp. This infuriated us even more. At the time, almost everywhere you would ask people in these communities whether they knew that places like this existed. This was especially true where there were some very unusual things going on, like this camp, particularly with a camp like Nordhausen, where the town is less than 2 miles away. I mean, within walking distance. They claim we never knew this place existed. This was just a plain defense mechanism to say we're not involved in this. We didn't know anything about it. You found in the German army a whole lot of this. There was almost like a trait on the part of the Germans whether in the service, in the army, or in civilian life. We're not involved in this, quote unquote. I thought, no, you were just wonderful people, that they obeyed the guy at the top. This is basically what I mentioned in my interview about my involvement of the camp. Now, my division was, as I mentioned in here, sent to that area not to liberate the camp as such at the time. That turned out to be almost a side issue, because we were there to clean out the Harz Mountains of these elite divisions that were holding out. The German army had thought that in the Harz Mountains they would make one of their last stands at the time. The fact that we saw these fins and other parts of the V-2 rockets caused us to look further, and that's how we uncovered the camp itself and saw all these bodies lying around there and what have you. So it was something by coincidence. The other people that had been there for possibly a few hours before we got there, other division that got there, at the time also were doing the same thing that we did, and that was to try to save the few people that were still alive at the time. I'm speaking of possibly somewhere around 500 to 700 people, all told, that were. And at the time, somewhat later, Life magazine got a hold of pictures that were very similar to the ones that we took ourselves, of the same. I remember seeing Life magazine sometime a good bit later on and seeing the photographs of these long trenches and bodies, just skeletal bodies, just stretched out alongside in there. And you couldn't tell live from dead people. And a few that were just barely able to raise their heads were, of course, taken up by medical officers and stabilized or treated. In very recent years, in the last few years, I met a lady here in Austin whose father was a medical officer in another division. That division, or these medical officers, he was one of them, remained at the camp to treat these people. He himself, from what I understand, had a nervous breakdown after 2 weeks of treating these horrible skeletal remains of these people. She eventually wrote a book about that after her father had died. But in any case, it was an experience that none of us could ever really forget, because, as I mentioned, when you came into the camp, there was this eerie silence and this terrible stench of dead people that had been lying around there. I mean, if anyone has had any experience of ever being in a field where you have dead cows or bloated animals, you have a similar stench. And this was a very similar experience. Yet we helped these people as best as we could. Now, we were there probably, all told, not more than 4 or 5 hours before we moved on. We were probably within half a day of the Elbe ELB